last week we were able to conduct an interview. It was really interesting, getting a chance to get a little historical perspective about a guy that is generally considered top 10 pound for pound all time. Kurt believes he has possibly the greatest resume in the history of boxing. And that's Harry Greb. We talked to a gentleman by the name of Steve Compton who has written a book about him, Live Fast, Die Young, The Life and Times of Harry Greb. So check this interview out that myself, Kurt, and Andy had a chance to do last week.
Boxing Asylum listeners, we're here with a very special interview today, something we haven't done. We're speaking to author Stephen Compton, who has just written a book, Live Fast, Die Young, The Life and Times of Harry Greb. So, Steve, when you got into this, Stephen Compton, what was it about Harry Greb when you look back at all of these great fighters from the past eras that made you want to do the research and put this guy's life to paper?
Well, initially, I mean, the way that my interest started with Greb and then kind of transformed into the idea to write the book was I had basically started out as a fan of Jack Dempsey's. When I had first kind of gotten an interest in boxing, Dempsey was sort of the guy that I looked up to and kind of envisioned as the quintessential champion boxer, and one day, gosh, it goes back to when I was a teenager. I was in the bookstore, and I used to pick up any magazine I could get on boxing. And so I picked up this magazine, and there was an article on this guy that I'd never heard about, named Harry Greb. And I've always had a fascination with the 20s and that era of boxing. And so as I kind of thumbed through the article on Greb, it made mention that he had gone after Dempsey and wanted to challenge for his championship, despite being only about 160 pounds. And here as a Dempsey fan, I thought, this is just ridiculous. I found it fascinating if it were true, but almost unbelievable. As many of the stories about Greb seem, and some of them are. And so, from that time on, I would just try and find anything that I could on Greb in terms of, information about his life, his career, and very quickly I found that there really wasn't a whole lot out there. At that point, I didn't even know that there had been a book written on him back in the 40s. Most of the articles were very similar and kind of rehashed the same stories that had always been out there. And, as time went on, I'd say probably the late 90s, I'd heard several times, that various projects were being worked on for, either a biography of Greb or a documentary or, something of that nature. And for whatever reason, none of those ever came about. And so, I thought, well, I've got to know more about this guy. And so I ended up going to my local university's library, and I just started looking up newspaper articles on him from the newspapers that we have here. I had never done any kind of research like this before. I had no idea what I would find, and very quickly I found, that newspaper coverage of boxing back in that era was phenomenal. I mean, it's far and away beyond anything we've got nowadays. And so, very quickly I amassed kind of this pile of newspaper articles on Greb, and by the time it got to be about knee-high, I decided, if nobody else can get this project done, then why shouldn't I? I mean, the information's just, kind of flowing, so I might as well try and put it together for other people like myself. And that's kind of how the project started,
And there's guys like me out there who are more modern boxing fans. We didn't get into it through the past, and we're not that astute as far as boxing history goes. So for those people that are stuck in the modern era and really know nothing about Harry, who is, pretty much regarded as a consensus top 10 all-time great fighter,
What is it
Right.
about him that you think the average boxing fan would really be into? What about him makes that era come to life?
Well, Greb is a guy that, I think if you're a fan of boxing, you like the fact that it's a combat sport. I mean, you like the idea that boxing is a one-on-one competition between, what we hope are the two best. And, I mean, that really typifies Greb's whole career. Greb was a guy that he didn't have to box. He came from a middle-class family, basically. It was a sport that he was drawn to, that like a lot of us, it kind of got in his blood, and he couldn't get it out of his system. And once he became a boxer, he went after the best fighters that he could fight, regardless of size or color. We're talking about an era when black fighters really weren't given much of an opportunity. And, he really wanted to be the best. And if you were one of those few guys that was able to either beat him or draw with him, he wanted to get you back in the ring that night and just keep on going and make sure that, he proved to the world that he was better than you. And, that's something that, in an era today where you've got fighters who, a lot of fans, I think, would say, cherry pick their opposition. You've got guys who go, 20 fights without really fighting anybody. They build up an undefeated record. They get, the backing of a powerful promoter, and then get a title shot and basically hit the lottery. And, if they win, they're a champion, one of 6 in that division. Or if they lose, they walk away with $1 million plus payday. I think a lot of fans are kind of disgusted with that today. I think that's one of the reasons why boxing is at sort of a low point. And, in his era, he was a guy that was, even in that era, he was atypical. But, in that era, you're talking about a time period when guys had 100 fights before they got a title shot, and Greb being atypical, he had probably 200 fights before he got a title shot. And, he had already beaten the best fighters in the sport from top to bottom, the ones that would face him. I mean, a lot of guys knew how good he was and wouldn't even climb into the ring with him. And so, I think that appeals to fans of sports in general, this idea of trying to prove yourself as the best and being a great competitor. And that's what he did. And, and it's a great story on top of that. I mean, it's a quintessential Roaring '20s story. So,
Speaking on his fights and what they had to do to get to a title shot, his official record is not reflective truly of the actual number of fights that he had, is it?
Well, when you say official, I'm assuming that you mean official decisions as opposed to newspaper decisions.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Well, nowadays people tend to discount newspaper decisions. In that era, they didn't so much, although they did to a degree, more because they didn't know exactly. If you got a wire report, if the AP or you got a report across the news wire that this fight happened out in Oklahoma, and X beat Y, you really don't know where that report came from. If you're living in New York. And so they tended to get discounted because of that. But if they were heavily covered fights and it was a no decision and there were a lot of newsmen there and, X beat Y, then most people considered that X beat Y regardless of whether or not it was an actual official decision. So in that regard, Greb's official decision record, because, he fought all over the place in a lot of venues that just didn't give out decisions. He's probably got, I don't know, maybe 100 decision fights, something like that, and 200 no decision fights. But again, at that time, that wasn't atypical. And, by the time he got his title shot, which was relatively late in his career compared to when he became a contender, he was well known as being one of the top fighters. He had been a contender for the middleweight championship since 1917. In 1921, he was supposed to have gotten a shot at then champion Johnny Wilson. Basically, everybody knew that the instant Greb got that title shot, he was going to be a champion. I mean, he was considered that much better than the champion at that point. And Wilson just refused to fight him. And it became such a scandal that Wilson got banned from the sport for a couple of years, basically. He had like 5 fights over 2 years, which is minuscule in that era. And finally, without being able to make any money, he was drawn back into the sport and forced to fight Greb. And of course, when he fought Greb in 1923, almost 2 years after he had ducked Greb, he lost. He lost his title, and Greb won his championship. But I mean, at that point, we're talking about a Harry Greb who was, 29 years old. He was blind in one eye. He had a lot of ring wear. Like I said, he had probably 200 fights plus at that point. And, he'd been a champion for 6 years. And unfortunately, that's kind of the norm in that era. You see fighters who they became champions and they dictated the terms a lot more even than we think of champions doing nowadays. And, the guys who were really great fighters like Packy McFarland and Jeff Smith and people like that who were just phenomenal, Sam Langford, Kid Norfolk, they didn't get their shots. Greb was really fortunate that he got his place in history to become a champion.
I'm going to send this over to Kurt Ward for a question.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Kurt.
How many of Greb's fights do you believe were filmed, and what is the biggest reason why we haven't seen the footage to this day?
Well, I know of a handful that I've confirmed were filmed. I've found advertisements for them, so we know that they were shown to the public. I've found mention that there were probably another few more that were being negotiated to be filmed prior to the fight, but then there was never any mention whether or not they were filmed or shown afterwards. So there were probably, at least 5 going all the way back to 1918. That's the first time I can find of him being filmed. As to why we haven't seen any footage, and I don't know how many people know this, but upwards of about 90% of all films from that era have been lost. Not just boxing films, not just Harry Greb, but 90% of motion pictures from from prior to, I think, World War II have been lost. And that's why, these film stocks back then, they were on what's called silver nitrate film, which was highly flammable. So a lot of them didn't survive because of that. They deteriorate over time if they're not handled with care and not stored in optimal conditions. And then during World War II, there was a drive to basically cannibalize these films for the silver content in them. So basically a lot of these films just didn't make it. Honestly, boxing is probably one of the most, if not, it probably is the most documented sport in the world, period. And it's remarkable that we have films going back to the 1890s of the sport, and quite a lot of them. But unfortunately, Greb is just one of those that's kind of fallen through the cracks that hasn't, to my knowledge, been lucky enough to have survived.
And from everything that you can just gather, Steve, how would you describe the style of Greb without actually being able to put it to film?
He changed his style in the latter part of his career due to the fact that he lost the sight in one eye during a fight. So when you lose the sight in one of your eyes, you have what's called monocular vision, which affects your depth perception. So that's obviously with a fighter who needs to be able to judge distance for his punching, that's going to be a major handicap. So later on in his career, Greb became a guy who would he would clinch a lot. He's called a foul fighter nowadays, but that's primarily because what he would do was he would grab a hold of a guy with his left hand and bang away with his right because he's holding that guy there where he can actually get a hold of him and know where to hit. During that time period and probably a little bit before, he was a guy who I kind of envisioned to be a mix between a Ricardo Mayorga and a Joe Calzaghe. He was described as someone who, wasn't pretty to watch, was kind of amateurish to look at, threw a lot of punches, used a lot of footwork, oddly enough. We think of him today as an aggressive Jake LaMotta type, but he was a guy who actually bounced around the ring and was really, really hard to hit. It was such you couldn't land a punch on his head. And so, the latter half of his career, I think when his footwork slowed down, he was a lot like a mix between Mayorga and Calzaghe. A volume puncher, but more stationary. Early on, I think he was more classical. I wouldn't say classical per se, but more classical in that, he did use a lot of footwork. He would bounce around the ring and leap in with volleys of punches, score on a guy, and then either get out before the guy could land on him or tie the guy up and wait for the ref to come and break him up. People, when they think about, when this footage comes out, if we ever find any footage of Greb, I wonder what he would look like. I always try to temper their expectations because, even in his prime, he was a guy that a lot of people said looked amateurish. They couldn't understand how he was so successful, but he had phenomenal physical gifts of speed and stamina that were just unmatched across the board. I mean, they talked about him being faster than a lightweight, as hard or harder to hit than Benny Leonard, who, the great lightweight champion. The guy could go 20 rounds and in the 20th round be going faster than he was in the first round. When you talk about volume punchers and guys who are hard to knock out like Greb was, he was a durable guy. Well, you know that the fight's going to go to a decision. And so who wins is going to be based on who landed more punches. And if you got a guy like Greb who's got, a bottomless well of stamina and throws, upwards of 100 punches around, odds are he's going to win. And so that's why, his record looks the way that it does. I mean, he would just bury these guys under blizzards of punches.
And we're going to send this over to Andy Patterson for a question.
Hi, Steve. Two things really is how up to date and how correct is the box rec record on Harry, because I believe some of the old fights or old fighters' records are still getting updated as we speak to this day.
Yeah, Greb's is close, and really the record that I've published with them, the only reason I've published all of his exhibition bouts, which of course BoxRec doesn't put their actual record on their main site. I've published all of his service bouts and his amateur bouts. Now, my record differs from theirs a bit in that a couple of his fights early on, essentially his first two fights that BoxRec, one I think they think is a double, it's not, and I think they think both of them, if they did have both of them up there, were amateur fights, and they weren't. I found quite a lot of evidence to show that his two fights that are listed as amateur bouts with Red Compton, I believe it is, after he'd had the first amateur fight with Fred Compton, those two bouts were professional bouts, and they mentioned that he got paid for them. There were news articles about him at the time that say, these guys just came out of the amateur ranks and things like that. So I'd say his record is close besides those two bouts. I think there was one bout that was an exhibition that BoxRec lists as an actual bout, and it wasn't. But other than that, I mean, his record's been really well researched. In the mid-'90s, I think it was, there were a couple of guys who really did a lot of diligent work on bringing his record together. And, they ended up publishing his record in Boxing Digest, I believe it was. And from that point on, his record has been pretty tight as far as the research goes. If there are any missing bouts on his record, and I tend to doubt that, I would say that it's there's a rumored bout that took place that was supposedly a professional bout before he actually entered the amateur ranks. And I haven't been able to find that. I looked in the town where the bout took place for 2 years prior to Greb entering the amateurs and didn't find any record of it. But that's the only one. I mean, I can trace his movements for almost every day of his career, and I don't think there's any bouts missing from his actual fight career.
Is it true that he fought Britain's Ted Kid Lewis in an exhibition fight also?
Who? I'm sorry?
Ted Kid Lewis.
No, no, he never fought Ted Kid Lewis. He fought a Kid Lewis in Pittsburgh, but it was actually an African-American fighter. Now, he was scheduled to fight Ted Kid Lewis in an exhibition bout in 1918, and I believe that either Ted Kid Lewis, he didn't make it to the bout, or there was a change in, the opponents for somebody that bumped a different guy into Greb's place to fight Ted Kid Lewis, and Greb ended up having to fight a heavyweight. But as far as I know, they'd never actually fought. So
one of Greb's greatest fights, from what I can recall, was the fight against the great Mickey Walker. From what I could read or understand, some people say that Greb was severely hurt a number of times to the body. Was he ever close to being stopped in that fight?
No, not really. It's interesting. That was kind of Greb's last great bout. They went into that fight with Greb. He was old. He was having difficulties making the middleweight limit. He had a lot of ring wear, and Mickey Walker was a young guy, a devastating puncher. He was just an all-around phenomenal fighter. He could do it all, literally. And so a lot of people were really thinking that, he was going to come in and he was to take the title from Greb, and this was going to be, the day that Greb kind of got old overnight. And at this point in his career, Greb's vitality was kind of waning a bit. His stamina wasn't what it once was. And so he started this change in his style where early on he would, basically start from the bell and just pile up points. And, he would get faster and faster as the rounds went on. But he always came out to an early lead. And at this point in his career, what he was doing was he would give up the first 2 or 3 rounds, stay competitive enough to make the opponent work, but allow the opponent to expend most of the energy and kind of burn himself up pretty quick. And so, in this fight, and it's nothing against Mickey Walker because he fought a great fight in that fight, but Greb basically did that. He let Walker come out, dictate the pace, and Walker did legitimately land some tremendous punches on Greb, and I'm sure he did hurt him several times. But I don't think that Greb was ever not in control of the fight. I think he knew what he was doing all throughout, and basically after the 3rd or 5th round, Greb took over, and it was for the most part all Greb until the final round. He almost knocked Walker out in the 14th round and spent, I think, a minute or a minute and a half with Walker defenseless on the ropes, his knees sagging, his hands down, and taking punch after punch after punch, full on the jaw. And to Walker's credit, he didn't go down. Greb actually had to steer him back to his corner after the round. And then, in the 15th round, Walker came out and won the 15th round. You're talking about 2 of the absolute greatest fighters that this sport has ever known.
Going to send it over to Kurt Ward for a couple more.
Yeah, Steve, you mentioned at the start of the conversation about Jack Dempsey. How close was that fight, if it was, to ever getting made, and what was the main reason why it never happened?
Well, there were negotiations and promoters who were trying to put that fight together really before Dempsey ever became champion. In 1918, I believe there were promoters that were trying to match those two. All the way through 1925 was probably the last time an actual offer was floated for it. But the closest they got was in 1922. Greb fought Tommy Gibbons for a title eliminator, and Gibbons was considered to be, the odds-on favorite. He was going to win. They were really pushing him to fight Dempsey. And Greb was almost an afterthought. He was this middleweight. He was considered a great fighter, but it was thought that Gibbons, coming off of I think something like 22 straight knockouts, was just going to be too much for him. He was going to defeat Greb, and they were going to go into this massive promotion between Gibbons and Dempsey. Well, the fight comes, and Greb shows up in perfect condition, and dominates Gibbons, really. I mean, I think outside of a couple of rounds, Greb took the fight easily. Dempsey was ringside, called it one of the greatest fights and greatest performances he'd ever seen. And, then the talk started for matching the two. Dempsey said, I'll fight him. He's earned a shot. Anybody that weighs 170, 175 pounds is a match for anyone in the world. So he was all for it at that point. Dempsey and Kearns, maybe, I can't remember if Kearns accompanied him, but they went to Europe. They went to Britain, France. They did a tour for the summer. During that time, Greb slaughtered Gene Tunney, the only loss of Tunney's career officially. And when Dempsey came back, he had totally changed his tune. He said, Greb's too small. He's out of the question as an opponent. Which is puzzling. I, to be honest with you, still don't really know what the motivation behind that was. He was really high on Greb as an opponent beforehand, and had totally done a 180. About 2 or 3 months later, undeterred, Pittsburgh promoters, Greb's hometown, were offering Dempsey a $100,000 purse plus 50% of the gate to face Greb. In a specially built arena in Pittsburgh. They contacted Kearns. Kearns said he'd reached he'd gotten the offer. He would like to talk about it with them. And then Kearns went quiet, and the promoters didn't hear anything from him. And they tried to get Kearns on the line to figure out what was going on. Kearns actually took a train, passed through Pittsburgh, didn't stop to talk to the promoters, and went straight to New York. And when he got to New York, he said, I haven't heard anything from these guys. I don't know, what's going on. And he pretended like, he thought the offer was bogus. Meanwhile, the promoters said, we don't understand why he's behaving like this. We've got this offer out there. We need to find out in time to build the stadium, because they were going to specially construct the stadium. In order to promote the show for a Labor Day event, which was, I don't know, a month away or 2 months away, something like that. And Kearns basically just refused to acknowledge them, refused to acknowledge their offer, and the fight died on the table. And that's about as close as it ever got. There were a couple of other offers that, where promoters had made Dempsey a fair offer, and, Dempsey pretended to consider it, but I don't think he ever really did. I don't think Dempsey wanted the fight. I don't think Kearns wanted it. To be diplomatic, I think they realized that the fight was too much risk for the reward. It was basically a no-win situation. Dempsey could fight guys that were easier to beat than Greb, get paid as much or more, and not have to face the risk, because Greb had, Dempsey would have been the favorite, but Greb would have had an outside chance of beating him. And so if Dempsey takes that fight and he wins, he's just beating a middleweight, and he's not going to win any prestige by doing that. If he takes the fight and loses, the great mighty Dempsey has lost to a middleweight. So, when you frame it in those terms, you can kind of understand why they weren't eager for the fight, and they were taking on fighters that, were probably not as good as Greb or as challenging as Greb, but looked better to the public, where Dempsey could either slaughter them or, have a competitive fight with them. Guys like Bill Brennan that Greb had dominated 4 times, Billy Miskey that Greb had beaten, Tommy Gibbons that Greb had beaten, George Carpentier, who had refused to fight Greb. He turned down a $250,000 offer, the largest purse of his career, I believe, to fight Greb. So you can see why Dempsey wouldn't have been eager to face a guy like that.
And it does sound like one hell of a story. And you took over a decade researching this. We wish you the best of success on this, Steve. What is the best place for the boxing fans out there to go and order this book?
I would say, if you're abroad, Amazon.com is probably the best place for the fans in Europe. Here in the United States, you can order either through BarnesandNoble.com, Amazon.com. I've even seen a copy of it on eBay through some book dealer on there. Or you can order a signed copy through me. Fans in Europe can order a signed copy through myself as well. However, I will say that for some reason, right now, the shipping between the United States and Europe is astronomical. And if you're trying to save money, I wouldn't recommend it. I would probably recommend going straight through Amazon and trying to get a better rate on the shipping.
All right. Well, the book is Live Fast, Die Young, The Life and Times of Harry Greb. The author, Stephen Compton. And Steve, we really appreciate your time today, and we wish you great success with this book. And thank you for putting in the work to recover a lot of information from a time that is often just not talked about anymore, given the lack of it. So thank you so much for building the story of Harry Greb for the people.
Great. Thank you very much. It was an honor and a pleasure, guys. I really appreciate the time.
Absolutely, and hopefully we get to talk to you later down the road.
Yeah, anytime.
Sounds great.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Take care, Steve. We really appreciate the interview.
Okay, thanks, guys. I look forward to it.